How's it going, guys and geeks? Welcome back to the Geek Critique Show. My name is Dakota, and today we're going to be talking about the correlation between a superhero movie's length and its critical reception. Now, we did a study on some 88 films, and we actually didn't believe that we were going to find anything substantial as far as are shorter films better or longer films better, or if there's a sweet spot in the middle. But believe it or not, the data is really interesting.
Show me what you got.
Do you enjoy long films, or would you prefer shorter films? When you sit down to watch a movie, how much of your time and energy are you willing to sacrifice for the sake of enjoyment? Oh, sorry, those aren't rhetorical questions. I really want you to answer that in the comment section below. I'm very curious. Personally, I've always enjoyed films with longer runtimes. Or, I thought I did. The Lord of the Rings series, for instance. I really enjoy the Lord of the Rings series. And the extended editions? Honestly, they're so transportive and immersive that time just seems to no longer matter when watching them. The time spent watching those films are, in my opinion, better time spent than watching twice as many films at half their length. Why? Because the content in its impressive length is consistently great film. To contrast, the Hobbit trilogy, while not as long, feels even longer due to the fact that the quality of the product isn't nearly as good as its predecessor. So, why am I talking about this? Hollywood has developed a trend over the past few decades of trimming the fat, so to speak, from blockbuster films, so as to allow for the most possible screenings of a film in its theatrical run. If the demand is high, cut the runtime down to a reasonable length so that the supply doesn't run dry. Some films get absolutely butchered when it comes to the studio's editing scenes or entire subplots out of a film for the theatrical cut. And some films make sense to cut down, as the theatrical cut actually serves to tighten the narrative or embellish what worked and what didn't. Usually we'll receive either a director's cut or an extended edition after a time, and generally the films given an extended cut are served, at the very least, marginally better than when they were in theaters. It's the director's original work of art, so to speak, fully restored to the artist's original vision. Of course, even directors cut down much of their unwanted footage to achieve a better end product. We recently got a comment that stirred in me the desire to actually study runtimes. The commenter mentioned that the only time he had ever left a Marvel film feeling like there was something missing was during Age of Ultron. Meanwhile, every time he left the theater after watching a DC film in recent years, he has had this nagging feeling that something was missing. And yes, almost all the DCEU films warrant an extended edition or director's cut of the film, because so much was lost trying to cram it into as many theaters as possible. And doubly yes, Age of Ultron is notorious for having a lot missing from its final cut. The original film was 3 hours and 30 minutes, but they cut it down to 2 and 20. 70 minutes removed. Certainly not all of it was quality footage, but enough was removed to leave the film feeling less than fully realized. The original Avengers also had about 40 minutes cut from its length, but Joss Whedon is a director who refuses to release extended cuts for his films, so because of studio meddling, we'll never see certain scenes that may be key to making those films even better. Another director that doesn't do extended cuts is Rian Johnson, whose latest film, The Last Jedi, comes in at over 2.5 hours, though he's gone on record as stating the original length was closer to 3 hours and 20 minutes. Those cuts were his decision though, so likely that film will feel complete. But getting back to superhero films, which are the crux of this study that we embarked on, it's very clear to audiences and critics alike when the film they go to see isn't what was intended. Suicide Squad notoriously had 7 different cuts. Batman vs Superman Ultimate Edition was far better than the original, and Justice League was mandated to be only 2 hours long from Warner Bros. CEO Kevin Tsujihara himself, the shortest of any DC film since Green Lantern. And really, it's a film that should have warranted even more screen time than the previous films, seeing as how they have to develop more characters. So the question on whether or not there is any correlation between the length of a superhero film and its critical reception began to take shape within me. Generally speaking, shorter films within the genre are seen to be an admission of failure on the studio's behalf, or that it was handled poorly. Longer films are generally seen as bloated or pretentious. There are obvious outliers to these rules. X-Men, which effectively modernized and legitimized the superhero genre as we know it today, only had a runtime of 104 minutes, and that was received very well. The Dark Knight Rises, one of DC's best films, has an incredible 165-minute runtime. And of course, there's the argument that a film should be as long as it needs to be to flesh out the characters and story properly without wasting screen time. But what if I told you that there was a sweet spot in superhero film runtimes that almost guarantees a better critical reception? Based on data I've collected from over 88 live-action American superhero films with theatrical releases since 2000, and using Rotten Tomatoes' aggregate score as a gauge for critical reception and appreciation, we created a scatterplot that begins to paint a pattern. It may not look like much just yet, but hold on. We started with DC and Marvel films, as these alone comprise over 60 films since 2000. We found that on average, films clocking in at 95 minutes or less had an average failing grade of only 29%. Films with 96 to 105 minute runtimes fared only marginally better at 33%. But here's where the average really starts to climb. At 106 to 115 minute runtimes, we see it jumps to 55%. And films ranging between 116 to 125 minutes had an average score of 61%. And now, remember when I said that there was that sweet spot for superhero films? Well, check this out. Marvel and DC films with runtimes between 126 and 135 minutes in length have an average rating of 86%. And as for films longer than that, we start to see a gradual downward trend. With a runtime of 136 to 145 minutes, the average goes down to about 74%, and then again it goes down to 73% for films any longer than that. We were a bit stunned to actually find that there was such a clear peak of appreciation for films around the 130-minute mark, or about 2 hours and 10 minutes in length. And we felt that this may be in part due to a lack of enough substantial evidence. So we added to it another 28 superhero films released since 2000, not related to Marvel or DC, to see how the data goes affected. And while the data was changed somewhat, there's still a strong peak at films between 126 to 135 minutes in length, achieving an 80% average Rotten Tomatoes score. So what does this all mean? That superhero films should now all be 2 hours and 10 minutes long as a principle? No, of course not. A film's length is not indicative of its quality, but this average does appear to gauge a studio's confidence in a film. Generally speaking, superhero films that clock in at less than 2 hours perform critically worse than those that are over the mark. And again, there are a handful of films below the 2 hour mark that are hugely successful, as well as extremely long superhero films that don't earn their bloated runtimes. Some films require more time and attention than others. The 3 longest Marvel films are also the 3 films with the most characters in it. And Infinity War will probably be no different, seeing that it's going to be over 2.5 hours in length, which makes total sense because of all the characters that are going to be in it. So as long as studios work with their directors to produce strong films and don't butcher their hard work by chopping it down a peg, the audience will remain happy. What do you think of this study? Is there still too little data to make any strong conclusions as of yet? We'd love to hear your thoughts down below, and we'd also like to thank our patrons over at Patreon for sponsoring our content. Shout out to Jason Fitz for his recent pledge over there at Patreon, and if you guys like what Jen and I do here at the Geek Critique Show and you want to see more of it, please consider clicking the link in the description below to our Patreon page. It's really hard to find stability here on YouTube now that the adpocalypse seems to be right back, but you know, if just 20% of our audience were to pledge a single dollar per month, Jen and I would be able to make this our full-time job and focus more time on creating quality content for you guys to enjoy. But as always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe if you don't already. Have a good one, guys.